Okay, guys, we're going to tackle civil rights this week, and we're going to start by looking at the civil rights movement. First thing you need to understand is the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. When we're talking about civil rights, we're talking about what the government must do to ensure equal protection and freedom from discrimination. If you remember from last week, civil liberties are the government's limitations, what the government can't do. So Congress can make no law. These are your protections from government interference. Again, civil rights is what the government must, in fact, actually do to protect people from discrimination and the removal of their civil liberties from outside groups. All right. Before the civil rights movement, there was a major court case, and you've probably heard of it before, Dred Scott versus Sandford. Now, this was a monumental case. A lot of people feel that it was the worst decision the court has ever handed down. The situation was you had this slave owner who had brought his slave with him into a territory that did not allow slavery. When he moved back to a slave state, the slave, Dred Scott, sued and saying that he's free now. He should be free. And this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court decides here is that because he is a slave and because he's descendant of slaves, that he is actually not, in fact, a citizen, and that nobody who is a descendant of a slave is a citizen. And as not being a citizen, they are not entitled to the civil liberties of the Bill of Rights, which means a lot. It means that anybody who's ever been descendant of a slave is not a citizen. So when the Civil War comes to an end, it's crucial that the Reconstruction Amendments are passed. So what were those three Reconstruction Amendments? They were the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. Free citizens vote. So let's break them down here. The three of these come together to create the Civil Rights Amendments for freed slaves, specifically. So the 13th Amendment bans slavery. Pretty simple, straightforward there. The 14th Amendment really is the counter to Dred Scott versus Sandford, because that case stated that any descendant of a slave is not, in fact, a citizen. You had to go back and change the Constitution to change that precedent. Or what are some things Congress can do if they dislike a decision? Well, since this decision was based off the Constitution, they can't just rewrite a law or write into law or write a new law. They have to change the Constitution itself. So enter the 14th Amendment. And what that says is that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. And all citizens are entitled to due process and equal protection of the law. So two very important clauses. And what it does then is it sets up that it doesn't matter who you're descended from. If you were born in America, if your family are citizens, you are a citizen. So it makes all those individuals who are descendants of slaves now citizens. And because they are citizens, it states that they have these protections of the civil liberties and protection from discrimination. So these two clauses together are extremely important and have come together to establish civil liberties to the states, the incorporation doctrine, but also have been used to help advance the civil rights movement. Now, the last of the Reconstruction Amendments was the 15th Amendment, and pretty simple here, just gave all men the right to vote. Now, that's not all citizens, because women were still excluded, but all men, regardless of race or ethnicity, now have the right to vote. So everything's hunky-dory, right? Not so much, because as soon as these things go into effect, Southerners begin to look at ways to restrict these rights. All right, so violate the civil rights of U.S. citizens. Now, right after the Civil War, Southern communities began passing what became known as black codes. And these were just laws that limited the economic and political freedoms of freed slaves, restricted where you could, when you could move around, what kind of jobs you could you could get, where you could live, banned the right to own a weapon. Essentially, what they were trying to do is create these laws that put freed slaves into this box that simulated slavery. These were banned essentially through the use of through the passage of the 14th Amendment. So these didn't last very long, but it just kind of shows you what these southern states started trying to do immediately following the Civil War and continue to do with Jim Crow laws and voting restriction laws. So there's two types of segregation you should know. One is de jure and the other is de facto. And when we're talking about de jure segregation, it's a fancy way of saying segregation by law. So these are the Jim Crow laws that you are familiar with: separate bathrooms, separate schools, separate hospitals, separate drinking fountains. These became considered to be constitutional as a result of the court case Plessy v. Ferguson. And this is where we get the separate but equal doctrine, which would dominate U.S. law for the next 100 years or so. And unfortunately, created this way of life that was definitely not equal, even if those facilities had been up to par. Because by separation, you are creating inequality. And this will be addressed in a later court case that we'll talk about. All right, de facto segregation. This is actually still pretty common. It's not by law. De facto segregation is segregation by fact, by custom and practice. It largely exists because of where people live. So segregation is a result of where people live. This can be done as a result of discriminating practices of refusing to sell homes to non-white families to keep a community white, but it wasn't lawful segregation. It wasn't in the law. It wasn't in the legal code. It was segregation based off of how people deal with one another. And now, while this is considered against the law now, you can't refuse to rent a property or sell a property to someone because of their race or ethnicity. It's foolish to think that it still doesn't actually occur, and it does. But another factor that takes place here is just income. Incomes largely depend on where you can and cannot live. And because income tends to be different around racial lines, you do get these communities that tend to be non-white and white. And we'll be take a closer look at that later. Happens largely in cities. All right, so the voting restrictions. There are a few here that you should be familiar with. The one that you're probably not too familiar with is the white primary. And the way this kind of worked was, for much of the South, the Democratic Party was going to win. It was a given that the Democratic Party was going to win. So whoever won the primary to run for the Democratic Party in the South was basically guaranteed to win. So what Democratic parties in the South started doing was saying that it was an exclusive club and they had the right to refuse entry to anybody based off of whatever means they felt was just. And this meant that in the primary elections, if you weren't white, you couldn't vote. And if you couldn't vote in the primary election, that meant that you had no say in who was going to run for the Democratic Party. If you had no say in who's going to run for the Democratic Party, you have no say in who's going to be the elected representative in your area. So that essentially eliminated black voters right there just by not even having a choice in the options themselves. The poll tax further made this difficult because now it is an economic burden. You have to pay this tax just to be able to vote, and many black Americans didn't have the money to be able to afford to do this, especially once the options are already shown to be unjust and unfair. The literacy tests, which many black Americans didn't have good schools. They were still coming out of slavery, where it was against the law to teach somebody who was a slave how to read or write, and so you don't have the infrastructure that has supported literacy. You don't have the history within the family. So literacy rates were pretty low among black Americans compared to white Americans. So this is another thing that kept black Americans from being able to vote. The grandfather clause was basically an exemption for poor whites who were illiterate. So if your grandfather could vote, you'd neither had to pay the poll tax or have to pass a literacy test. Well, if you were a freed slave, your grandfather was a slave and could not vote. So it allowed poor white voters to be able to vote while keeping black voters disenfranchised. Fighting segregation in schools. So let's start by introducing the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So the purpose of this organization was to advance civil rights through the court system. And the chief lawyer at the time of the civil rights movement was Thurgood Marshall. He also becomes the first black Supreme Court justice. He's the one who's responsible for arguing Brown v. the Board of Education, which is one of the cases that you must know. And again, this would be somewhat familiar to you. But in Brown v. Board of Education, this was a case challenging the segregation of schools. The question being, did the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment provide for the desegregation of the public school system? And ultimately, the courts did decide that separate but equal educational facilities were inherently unequal and violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So, in this case, one of the key arguments they used, if you see the picture over here in the top right, was this doll case. And by presenting young children, white and black dolls, asking positive, negative questions, they were able to determine that young black children were learning at a very early age, being socialized to view white children as superior to black children. And so any positive type question, they were leaning towards the white dolls, and any negative type question, they were leaning towards the black dolls. Using this as part of the argument, they will show that just by segregating children based on color, whether or not the schools are themselves equal in the quality or not, isn't the point. Just by separating individuals on these purposes, you are teaching these children that they are not equal, and therefore it can never be equal. So this overturns Plessy v. Ferguson in regards to schools and begins the first big chip in the Jim Crow era. So let's move on to busing. Just because schools are now told they have to desegregate doesn't mean that they do. How familiar you are with your civil rights movement history, you might remember Little Rock 9, in which 9 African American students tried to attend Little Rock Central High School. And in that situation, they were barred by the governor of Arkansas, and the U.S. military had to get involved. This was a great example of the president enforcing a judicial decision. But even more low-key than that, you had the issue of schools being segregated not just by the legal code, but by geography. And the situation here is when we have something called white flight, when white Americans began leaving the urban centers for the suburbs, it created this geographical divide, this de facto segregation, where the cities became largely impoverished and largely made up of black Americans, and the suburbs became wealthier and largely made up of white Americans, and the schools reflected that. So to try to create a balance here, what school districts ended up trying to do was start a policy known as busing. And so school districts began sending children farther distances from where they lived in order to create a more diverse demographic within those schools, which was pretty controversial at the time. Many parents objected to their children being sent pretty far away rather than being close to where they lived. There was lawsuits involved. The courts did decide that busing is constitutional, but not required, as long as the demographics were not created by the legal system. School districts did not have to attempt to desegregate these schools. And so many school districts did begin canceling these busing programs. Affirmative action has been another policy to attempt to rectify the wrongs of the history of degradation and the history of slavery and segregation and the impacts that it has had on the Black community as well as other minority groups. So here's the concept. You provide special considerations to individuals based on their characteristics such as race and gender when admitting students into higher education, into the university systems, or even in the job field. So another way to think about this is if there's a tie between a white candidate and a Black candidate, the tie goes to the individual with less privilege, and in this case, the Black candidate. Opponents of this, as you see in the top right corner, would claim that this is reverse discrimination and it negatively targets white males, while supporters will, as you see in the bottom right corner here, a cartoon supporting affirmative action, would point that this is necessary to reverse the consequences of privilege. All right. And the court system, you have UC versus Bakke, and in this situation, a guy was applying to get into UC Berkeley. He was denied. Berkeley was using a system of affirmative action that was used a quota system, so he was eliminated from UC Berkeley's acceptance because of this, and the courts actually ruled against the UC Berkeley in this situation, but did affirm that affirmative action is constitutional, just not through the quota system. So there's a few restrictions here for affirmative action when it's being applied. It can't be based on a quota system. Right? You can't say, well, 20% of our student body must be Black and 50% of our student body must be female and so forth. You can't base it off that. It can be a consideration. It just cannot be the primary factor, and especially cannot be through that number-based system. It can't be based on a point system either. So the school must have a compelling interest as well. All these things combined, it can be a factor, it cannot be the primary factor, and it cannot just be a numbers factor. All right, civil disobedience. This is the act of peacefully breaking a law that you consider to be unjust. This is not created by Martin Luther King Jr., but it was definitely employed by him. The concept here is, you're purposefully going to jail to make the point and to draw attention to the issue. The primary example here is when Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested during the Birmingham campaign, which we'll watch a video later in class that goes into more detail here. But Martin Luther King Jr., while he's in jail, writes this letter, becomes known the letter from Birmingham jail, in defense of civil disobedience. All right, so some of the famous quotes here: freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed. And justice too long delayed is justice denied. So he's just forcing the point that, you can't just sit back on your heels and just wait for change to happen, because it's not going to happen. You see an unjust law, you can't just say, well, geez, golly, I look forward to one day people opening their eyes and making the change that needs to be done. Now, he says you have to be active, you have to be aggressive in this, but you have to do it peacefully. You need to be confrontational but peaceful, and bring attention to the issue by breaking what you would consider an unjust law. Some prime examples here: we have when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. You've got the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins that launched all kinds of other sit-ins, where individuals would go to white-only lunch counters and sit down to challenge these segregation laws there. The Freedom Riders, in which they rode buses throughout the South using a series of sit-ins. The Birmingham campaign itself, marching in the streets and whatnot, and the Freedom Summer, where activists went into the South and began actively trying to register Black Americans' vote, where there were laws that really obstructed their ability to do so. And the Selma March, which is another large-scale march to bring attention to restrictions on voting. So all these things hopefully are familiar to you from your U.S. history course last year, but they're all prime examples in small and large ways of civil disobedience, which, again, Martin Luther King argued in support of with his letter from Birmingham jail. And again, we'll take a closer look at that in class. Gains from the civil rights movement. All right, so the two primary laws you have to know: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's now a ban on racial segregation in schools and public places, and it bans employment discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, and gender. And the courts did have to consider this. Was this overreach by the federal government? And they determined it wasn't, because it follows in line with their Commerce Clause, the power to regulate interstate commerce, and that these things fall under commerce. So it's substantial here. So this ends the Jim Crow era, right? It ends de jure segregation, and just a pivotal moment in American history. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 addresses the issue of the voting disenfranchisement laws by outlawing the literacy tests and authorizing the federal government to register voters in hostile locations, in which voter intimidation and other factors were used to prevent Black Americans from voting and registering to vote. And if you look over here on the right with this map, you can kind of see the impact that this had from 1960 to 1971, especially looking at places like Mississippi and Alabama, where it was especially bad. You see the jump in registered voters from the Black population, just substantial, because they removed these hurdles. Some other things, though: you have the 24th Amendment that specifically banned poll taxes. Smith versus Allwright banned the white-only primaries, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968 banned discrimination in housing. All of these are also very important to know for the context of the gains made by the Civil Rights Movement. All right, guys, we'll start with women's movement in the next video.